If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. So today's episode, I'm going to be addressing a topic that's been brought to the forefront by recent events in the Libertarian Party. Now, myself, as part of the Libertarian Christian Institute, I have to give the usual disclaimers that I'm not telling you how to vote or making any endorsements. But I think it's important to discuss these things going on with the Libertarian Party from time to time as a matter of education and discussing libertarianism as a movement and a political philosophy. Chase Oliver is a self-identified gay Christian. He secured the presidential nomination, and I think it's for the Libertarian Party, and I think it's crucial to visit what the Bible actually says about homosexuality, LGBT issues broadly speaking, and why this matters for us as Christians, as libertarians as well. Chase also holds views regarding hormone replacement therapy and puberty blockers for minors, and it's important to talk about this as well as we explore as Christians these areas of political and theological overlap. Now, before I dive into it, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, please subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Wherever you're at, I have been extraordinarily appreciative of a lot of the growth that I've received over the last couple weeks on YouTube. But I don't want that to come at the expense of other platforms as well. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening, please, can you leave a 5-star review and a written review at that if you can? Because that really helps to boost the podcast in the algorithms. And so that way more people are able to see it. And obviously, if you're watching on YouTube, that's completely fine as well. Please make sure you're subscribed and give this video a thumbs up. And as always, please consider going to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and signing up to be an LCI Insider, which is a monthly donation of $10 or more a month. And that gets you access to all sorts of perks, behind the scenes, early access to books and other merchandise discounts, things like that. So definitely, low cost, $10 a month. You get a lot of bang for your buck with that. And we at LCI are a nonprofit. And so we operate pretty much entirely off of donations from listeners like you. And that helps us out tremendously. So, I have one other small bit of housekeeping here, which should be fun to talk about. So, I don't know if anybody noticed this. I did give a warning about this a couple episodes back. I don't know if it was actually during a numeric episode or if it was during one of my live shows. But I told you guys back when I was going through my little sickness with my throat cold that I was going to be producing an episode using AI technology that the producer for LCI has. And last week's numeric episode, Biblical Anarchy podcast number 67, I think. Should have had that prepared on hand, shouldn't I? It's hard to keep track after a while, especially now that I'm doing a lot of live streams. I don't always keep track of where we're at in the queue anymore. Episode 67, Do Christian Ethics Conflict with Libertarian Legal Theory? That audio and video is entirely produced using AI. So you were listening to my voice and you were looking at me, but it wasn't me and it wasn't my voice. So it's kind of cool and creepy at the same time. None of you caught it, at least in the comments that I've seen. So apparently it's somewhat passing, although I was able to go, it doesn't quite, I don't think the AI quite caught my cadence. I pause a lot and I pontificate and I can get really dramatic and pause a lot, right? The AI almost made my speech too perfect and too monotone in a way. Regardless, very interesting. And it was very useful to at least get some content out there during a time where my voice was pretty much non-existent. My voice is, I think, still a little raspy, but now it's back. All right. Well, I wanted to get all that housekeeping out of the way here before we dive into today's episode. All right. So LGBTQ, homosexuality, gender affirming care, as it's called, for children. Why this matters? Well, before diving into the specifics, it's important to clarify the different perspectives within Christianity regarding these issues. Broadly speaking, there are 4 positions: side A, side B, side X, and side Y. Side A views LGBTQ as created by God, and therefore not sinful in the slightest for any of their identity being, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, gay, and even the actions themselves are not inherently sinful. God created them to want those things. That's side A. Side B views homosexual sex as sinful, but not same-sex attraction. And it would affirm the idea that you can be a gay Christian or even a trans Christian, but it would say that acting out on desires would be sinful. Side X considers that not only is the action sinful, but the attraction itself is also particularly sinful and something that Christians should be cured of. And then side Y recognizes that Christians may struggle with same-sex attraction, but insists that they shouldn't identify with it, emphasizing that our identity is in Christ. I would say that I mostly fall on side Y, although I do think that people can be delivered from that same-sex attraction or from gender dysphoria. I know people who have overcome that. I know some people who continue to struggle with those desires, but have given them up to the Lord and find freedom and salvation in their lives and able to pursue the things that God has for them. So the biblical case against homosexuality and transgenderism as a consequence, I'm going to focus on homosexuality here, but the arguments for that really tie into the arguments against transgender ideology as well. So there's going to be a lot of overlap. But the arguments against that, why they are considered sinful within the Christian worldview, based on what the Bible teaches, would be grounded in several key scriptural passages and theological arguments. These arguments would also carry over into the transgender conversation, as this is really all, again, it's under the umbrella of what the Bible defines as man and woman and what is normative regarding sexuality for men and women. All right, so here are the points typically cited to go kind of numeric order here. The first argument is going to be the order and design of creation itself. We would start in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The creation narrative establishes that God created humanity in his image, male and female. Genesis 1:27. And this means not that God is both male and female, or that male and female are just like these weird influx things, but rather God created humanity to be both distinctly, some of them to be distinctly male and some of them to be distinctly female. And there's a complementary nature between men and women. And this is highlighted in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, where it states that man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Jesus affirms this model in the New Testament then, in Matthew 19, verse 4 through 6, and Mark 10, 6 through 9. He cites this Genesis passage, emphasizing that from the beginning, God made humans male and female, and that the marital union is between one man and one woman. Now, some people are even going to even contest not just homosexuality and transgenderism, but they're going to press on the assertion of it being one man and one woman. And touch on that here briefly, because it is worth mentioning that some Old Testament figures had multiple wives or multiple sexual partners, and some people use this as an argument that the Bible supports polygamy, but this is not true. Touch on this really quickly. Again, it says a man, not men, and it says a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, not wives, and they'll become one flesh. So that right there doesn't really make it ambiguous, but let's talk about some of the examples here and if those were highlighted as a good or a bad. Because we do have to remember that the Bible will sometimes be prescribing things, and sometimes it's just describing what happened, not necessarily with a approval of what happened. Abraham took Hagar as a second wife, and this led to family strife. You can read about this in Genesis 16. Jacob, in the Bible, not me, I am happily taken by one woman. That's enough for me. But Jacob of the Bible had multiple wives, which wasn't even by design, necessarily. He was tricked. But his multiple wives and concubines caused jealousy and conflict among his children. And we can read about this in Genesis 29 and 30. Obviously, Joseph being sold into slavery, and God used what man intended for evil for good, but still it led to problems, right? David and his multiple marriages led to significant familial, oh my gosh, can't even say that. David and his multiple marriages led to significant familial turmoil, including the rebellion of his son Absalom in 2 Samuel 3:13 through 18. And David also was violating the command given in the book of Deuteronomy regarding the conduct of the king, where it said the king should not have many wives. Solomon, similarly, has numerous wives, turns his heart away from God, which leads to idolatry and ultimately division in his kingdom. So these stories will describe polygamous relationships and highlight the strife and the dysfunction that accompany such arrangements, including a departure from and implying a departure from God's ideal. All right, so again, we talked about in Matthew 19, when Jesus affirmed the Genesis creation, the creation design of man leaving his father and mother to be joined to his wife. If there was like some kind of mistake in the Old Testament, by keeping those singular, Jesus had a chance to correct that, comment on it, and he did not. So he's affirming it as being, exclusive to the man and the woman. Paul in 1 Timothy 3, in 1 Timothy 12, and in Titus 1, instructs the church elders, that they must be the husband of one wife, indicating a standard of monogamy for those in positions of spiritual authority. Now, maybe some people came to the church with baggage, right? Maybe they already had multiple partners, and they were sorting that out. They had messy pasts. It was important then to be clear that the people who should be the spiritual leaders of the flock should have their affairs in order. And one such example is being in a monogamous marriage, which is the only type of marriage the Bible defines as normative. Again, we have to always make the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive. We would expect that the leaders are setting an example and a precedent for the rest of the Christian community. The symbolic representation that marriage gives us of Christ and his church, which is described in Ephesians 5, Paul compares the relationship between a husband and wife to that of Christ and the church. Christ has one bride, not multiple brides. The church is his bride. He doesn't have 2 churches or 5 churches or 20 churches. He has one church. And so this symbolizes the monogamous nature and exclusive nature of that relationship with the husband at the head as Christ is at the head. So I would say in conclusion, and there's other arguments that you could be made here, but in conclusion, we would see that while polygamy was practiced, it was not prescribed as normative. Rather, we see that it often had negative consequences and that the clear prescription, Old and New Testament, is one man and one woman. So that's the created order and design. In Old Testament law, we're going to move to Leviticus 18 and chapter 20. These verses explicitly prohibit same-sex relationships. You should not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And chapter 20, verse 13, prescribes severe consequences, indicating these are serious offenses. We have New Testament teachings. Romans 1, Paul describes in verse 26 and 27, same-sex relations as contrary to the nature of man and as a result of humanity's rejection of God. He speaks of both men and women exchanging natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and characterizes such actions as dishonorable passions. Excuse me. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, Paul lists various behaviors that are incompatible with inheriting the kingdom of God, and including men who practice homosexuality. 1 Timothy 1, verse 10, Paul includes those who practice homosexuality among those whose behaviors are contrary to sound doctrine. Again, we would have theological considerations, the theological argument about the complementary nature of male and female as part of God's design. So it's not just a biological design and imperative, but one that is relational, spiritual, and societal. And the union of man and woman reflects the image of God and fulfills his design for procreation, family, and society. The Bible also I would say presents marriage as a covenant. It's a covenantal relationship between one man and one woman. And again, this covenant reflects Christ's covenant and relationship with his church, which is also depicted as a bride and groom, which I already mentioned. And throughout church history, the consistent teaching of both the church fathers and the broader Christian tradition has been against homosexuality. And although there are some examples within church history of figures who did, it's not new that some people have tried to change this norm, the consistent standard has been that anyone who has tried has been corrected or excommunicated. I won't go into the history here, but I will link in the description a very good episode of the Inspiring Philosophy podcast done by Michael Jones, who had a conversation with Trent Horn on some of the claims made by Side A regarding homosexuality among the church in church history, and why these claims are either extremely exaggerated or just entirely wrong and fabricated. So Side Y, or my position, would argue from these biblical mandates then, and an understanding of sin, the fallen, depraved nature of man, that homosexuality is to use our bodies and our sexuality in ways that are disordered and therefore sinful. And that even the attraction itself is a sinful desire, and it reflects a sinful and corrupted or disordered nature and relationship with one's sexuality and body. Now, Christians, you can profess Christ and maybe still struggle with certain sinful desires. That's not abnormal at all. But they should be walking in obedience. They should ground their identity in who God says they are, not who the world or their sin says they are. They should be surrendering their will to Christ and allowing the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit to purify them of all sinful desires as they walk with Christ through their life. And this might not be an immediate victory, but the trajectory and initial affirmation of Christ's authority in their life is essential. And this isn't like a special prescription for homosexuality. This is essentially the same prescription for all other sinful desires that Christians might find themselves struggling with or having before they come to Christ. Now, I want to make sure, I want to deal with some of the arguments made from the side A position. And I want to make sure I am fairly representing those who would hold to side A. To do this, I'm actually going to be referring to a post from a friend of mine, fellow podcaster, Hody Johns. He made this post a couple years ago, and he argues that the Bible does not condemn homosexuality, but in fact condemns those who do. He bases his arguments on several key points, which I'll address one by one. And again, the reason I want to use Hody here is because I know him. I think he did a good job of encapsulating a lot of these arguments, and I can have Hody on the show for a follow-up conversation after this episode airs. So the first argument Hody makes is that there's a misinterpretation of the sin of Sodom. Hody argues that the sin of Sodom was not homosexuality, but rather social injustice, gluttony, laziness, pride, and rape. His second argument is that the Leviticus verses are mistranslated and actually refer to rape, incest, and adultery, not consensual homosexual relationships. 3, Hody believes that Romans 1:26-27, that these verses are often misread, and therefore they actually address hypocritical religious scholars rather than condemning homosexuality. Fourth argument would be that he suggests that in 1 Corinthians, the terms malakos and arsenokotai, that these Greek terms refer to undisciplined or indulgent behavior and exploitation rather than homosexuality. In Matthew 5, he posits the term raka, used by Christ, is a derogatory term for a homosexual, indicating that Jesus condemned the condemnation of homosexuality. Hody argues that Christ's example of healing on the Sabbath shows we should prioritize compassion over strict adherence to the law, and that it might be misinterpreted. Hody notes that historical Jewish scholars, rabbis, and poets openly practiced homosexual relationships, indicating that maybe they have a different understanding. And he claims that Christ condemned overall hypocritical judgment and emphasized compassion over moral condemnation. So I want to dive into these arguments one by one. Now, again, I want to reiterate that this isn't just me going over biblical theology 101 just for the sake of it. Not motivated by some kind of desire to focus on these topics. I actually think I generally don't focus on these topics. But because the Libertarian Party candidate is sort of bringing these topics to the forefront because of his own identity as being a homosexual Christian, and because of his positions, I want to first define what the Christian positions are, talk about the libertarian overlap, and then connect that to how we should be responding to things today. So let's dive into Hody's arguments here. The first being the misinterpretation of the sin of Sodom. So traditional interpretations by Jews and Christians include a condemnation of homosexual acts as part of Sodom's sin. Broader context of biblical sexual ethics, I would say, affirms this understanding. The Bible consistently frames the sin of Sodom not just as a lack of hospitality or supposed social justice failures, but also a moral and sexual perversion. The traditional reading is supported by various scriptural cross-references, such as Jude 1:7, which mentions sexual immorality and perversion as part of Sodom's transgressions. The citation, quote, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." So if the sin was only that it was violence, rape, the lack of hospitality, well then sexual immorality and violence and rape would have been the charges. Instead, the text here affirms the traditional interpretation of homosexuality being disordered and unnatural. The commentary provided by Christians such as Hody isn't entirely wrong, as it is also that they had a lack of hospitality, but where Hody is wrong is that he sort of tries to assert that this is like an exhaustive interpretation, that the lack of hospitality, the not caring about their neighbor, that's exhaustive of their sin, when no, those were just other examples that have been given by the witness of Scripture. Next, the translation and context of the Leviticus verses. So, to read Hody's argument here, he said that in the Old Testament, Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13, which respectively read, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination, and if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, and they shall surely be put to death, their blood is upon them." Both abominations are listed again as toeba, which again refer to rape, incest, and adultery. More important, both use a word to refer to the act itself, mischief. This word is used only one other time in the Bible, in Genesis 49:4, where it clearly has a both an incestual and involuntary nature to the sexual encounter. So that's Hody's argument here. And so let's get into this. So toeba, abomination, is what it's translated to in Leviticus, is used broadly, including prohibitions against various sexual practices. The explicit mention of lying with a male as with a woman, well, when we interpret those words, that is consistently been interpreted as a prohibition then, would combine it with, saying, do not do this. It is a toeba. It's many things could be a toeba, including a male lying with a male as with a woman. And so that's why we interpret this as a prohibition against homosexual acts. Doesn't say only if involuntary, it says as with a woman. I mean, are we to read that the male lying with the woman is rape or involuntary? Like, it doesn't say if you lie with a male in violence, it says if you lay with a male as with a woman, sort of implying that it's consensual, implying it's being done for the pursuit of what you should be doing with a woman when you lie with her. The context of these verses in chapters 18 and 20, it's listing different prohibitions, mostly sexual prohibitions, and these are meant to maintain the purity of the community. So these include incest, adultery, bestiality, but also homosexual acts. The uniformity and clarity of the language suggests that this is a comprehensive condemnation against all such behaviors. And it's not limited to just non-consensual acts. So in chapter 20, I'll also point out that it literally calls out and condemns adultery explicitly before verse 13. So would it be redundant then on Hodey's position to say that it's calling out adultery again? I would also say that we can't even read into what it says in verse 13 of chapter 20. It's impossible to read rape into that. To read it again. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Well, why would, if it's rape or incest or involuntary, why would they both be punished? That wouldn't follow. Rather, it's implying that their sin is both upon them, meaning that they're both guilty. So it's clearly describing consensual acts. Does not ever say, unless it's a marriage, unless it's a monogamous homosexual marriage, and marriage is never even defined as male-male or female-female. Now, regarding the word miskeve, Hodey's argument is logically fallacious. Again, he's trying to argue that because it was used in one context in Genesis, that context being incest, that would carry over. But that doesn't really follow. Here's a demonstration of why this logic is fallacious. If I was writing a book, and let's say in chapter 10, I describe a butcher butchering an animal, and I wrote that the butcher took his tool and stabbed the animal's flesh with it. But back in chapter 1, I wrote the butcher stabbed the farmer in the chest with his tool. Does the murderous context of the word stab in chapter 1 mean that the meaning of the word stab in chapter 10 also has murderous connotations? That wouldn't follow. We don't define the context or the meaning of words based upon how they can be used elsewhere. We look at the surrounding context of how that word is used in the particular passage we're looking at to give us how it's being used. Words can kind of have multiple connotations depending on how they're being used. Like if I say, I see the clouds, that's implying that I'm able to look with my eyes at something and that the light is reaching my eyes, my brain's interpreting it. Whereas if I'm in a conversation and I go, oh, I see, well, I'm not really saying like, oh, I was blind up until a second ago and now I see. No, I'm saying that, oh, I can understand your argument. And so sight there speaks to a sort of perception of a certain understanding, being able to see in a figurative way. And so words have multiple connotations, but we define and discover what those connotations are and those meanings are based on the context that they're in, not based on, oh, well, that word had this connotation in this other passage. So I don't think that's good argumentation. Let's dive into Romans 1. The text of Romans 1:26. We're going to analyze this and see if Hodey's interpretation is sensible. Again, what Hodey says is that, here we go. He says, the first chapter of Romans appears to be the most scathing, but this is only because of a careless reading. For it states that for this cause, God gave them into vile affections, for even their women did change their natural use into that which is against nature, unlike men. The context here, he says, is supremely important. Who is them? Well, them, according to earlier verses, are men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. They are fake religious scholars who, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They are judgmental and pretend to be great. God magnifies their sinful nature. Their homosexuality is not a matter of sin. It is a matter of humiliation because they have condemned homosexuality as a sin. It can be a tough read, especially in the Greek translation that we have. The most important clarification comes from the very first verse of chapter 2, following the alleged condemnation. Therefore, thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself, for thou does the same things. After reading these verses with open eyes, It is difficult to not laugh at how prophetic these verses have become. Some of the most homophobic people have themselves dabbled in homosexuality. All right, so that is Hodey's position, and let's see if that holds up to scrutiny. So let's read Romans 1, starting in verse 18 to get the context. Before this, you have Paul talking about his desire to visit Rome. Paul just kind of establishing, his general introductions like he usually does at the beginning of his writings. Verse 16 through 17, he's just talking about how the righteous will live by faith. So I'm not leaving out important context here. The context that we really need starts in verse 18. For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness shall suppress the truth, since what can be known about God is evident among them. God has shown it to them. So I don't know what Hodey means here, that them is fake religious scholars. He seems to be bringing something from outside the text into this, because what Paul is talking about here is about people. He's saying that God's invisible, I'm picking up verse 20, God's invisible attributes, that is his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse, for they knew God. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and four-footed animals, and reptiles. God delivered them over in their desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. For this reason, God delivered them over to disgraceful passions. Their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. The men, in the same way, also left natural relations for women, and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. So the they here is not just scholars, it's the world. It's the people who, it's saying that everyone knows God and God's moral decrees and moral, character in their heart, that this is revealed in the natural world, and that they are without excuse. And that by rejecting God, they thought themselves wise, and they erected fake gods to worship, and then were given over to sexual immorality. So I don't think Hodey is even properly interpreting this text without even diving into some of the specific language here in the Greek. Let's look at verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. So, starting with Hared Oken, Autus, Hoteos, so that means God gave them up. This phrase indicates that God actively allowed them to follow their dishonorable passions as a consequence of their actions. And then eis pathe atemias, to dishonorable passions. So the term pathe generally means passions or desires, and atemias means dishonorable or shameful. So, and then haite garthe le auton, for their woman. And then the mete lengths eintain fusi kane cresin eistain pa pare fusin, exchange natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. Mete laxen means exchanged or changed. And then where is it? Sorry, ten fusin kane means natural use or natural function, and then ice tain pare fusain means for those that are contrary to nature. So Hodey's trying to suggest that the passage about fake religious teachers who are judgmental, I've already shown that's not the case, and he's saying that the Greek is a tough read, but I'm not some great expert at Greek, but just using basic Greek translation here, these terms don't have ambiguous meanings, and putting them together, they give us exactly what we read in the English. God gave them up to their dishonorable passions, and they exchanged natural relations. So this is straightforward. And the reading implies that the actions, the same-sex relations, are considered contrary to the natural order and are a result of God allowing them to follow their dishonorable desires as a judgment. Hodey also points out that in Romans 2, that it's warning against judgment. So the English says, therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Paul's message here is about the hypocrisy of judging others while practicing the same sins. But that doesn't negate the sinful nature of the sins he's just highlighted. So sure, if there's people who are, sexually impure, who are condemning people who are sexually impure, that's hypocrisy. But it doesn't change the moral prescription of what is sexually pure and what is sexually impure. It's just condemnation of hypocrisy. And so I think a sensible reading of the text here, Romans 1, does not support Hodey's interpretation. We will move on now to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Read Hodey's argument again. Malakos and arsenokotai. Malakos has in modern times referred to effeminate or weak men. The actual word means soft and is more often used describing bedding or pillows. However, at that time, this softness was meant to refer to being undisciplined and indulgent. Aristotle actually has a lot to say about Malakos. None of it has to do with being homosexual or even effeminate. He wrote, of the dispositions described above, the deliberate avoidance of pain is rather a kind of softness. The deliberate pursuit of pleasure is profligacy in the strict sense. Arsenokotai is a word that appears to be invented by Paul. It does not appear before this time. It's a combination of two words, one which means male and the other which means bed, which would refer to condemn men that bed other men. But that's not how the audience took to mean when Paul spoke of it. There's a figurative meaning here which implies the exploitation of somebody's body for personal gain. The crass sexuality is intended to be a symbol of someone taking advantage of someone. Lowbrow crime is described as robbery or mugging. White-collar crime, though just as bad or worse, is not referring to robbery as robbery or mugging. This word has been invented to deal with shorting people of their profits, cheating business partners and workers, as is this would be an example of arsenokotai. It should be noted that there are many examples of this word borrowed from Paul being used to describe theft by the wealthy, and no examples until translated into English of this word used to mean homosexuality. All right, so let's dive into this. So Hodey and others make the argument that Malakos refers to moral laxity, a weakness of character or a lack of discipline, as opposed to being traditionally understood as meaning effeminacy. Aristotle's philosophical discussion of Malakos indeed focuses on moral and physical laxity. However, Paul's use of the term in a moral vice list serves a completely different purpose. So let's go to the passage here in 1 Corinthians 6. If any of you have a dispute against another, how dare you take it to the court before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the trivial cases? Don't you know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? So if you have such matters, do you appoint as your judges those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is not one wise person among you who is able to arbitrate between fellow believers? Instead, brother goes to court against brother, and that before unbelievers. As it is, to have legal disputes against one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves do wrong and cheat, and you do this to your brothers and sisters. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, or males who have sex with males. No thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, or swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ by the Spirit of our God. That's the passage there. Again, Paul's using this term in a moral vice list and condemning moral actions. I don't think he's condemning people being soft, saying you won't inherit the kingdom of God. There's nothing else in that list that even, he talks about thieves, talks about greedy, which would be like being covetous, being drunk, being verbally abusive, swindling, which would be being deceitful, idolaters, adulterers. These are all sins. Why would he throw a little condemnation of like, oh, what if you're just kind of soft, right? What if you're just kind of weak? But it doesn't really make sense as an inclusion there. Words can have multiple connotations, as I've talked about already, depending on the context. So when Aristotle's talking about it, he's using it in a distinct way from Paul in an ethical and theological context. The placement of malakos in the vice list is significant, and it's grouped with other sexual sins, such as arsenokotai. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'd say the way that Paul's audience would have understood this list as it's being given is referring to a form of sexual immorality, which he had just listed. He said sexual immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, or males who have sex with males. So that's how it's translated in the English. So let me read this in the Greek to the best of my ability here, or at least the parts of myself, or not you that the unrighteous ones of God kingdom not will inherit, not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, that's pornoi, sexually immoral, nor the idolaters, nor adulterers, nor malokai, nor arsenokotai. That's what it's saying there in the Greek. So the malokai and the arsenokotai, malakos, arsenokotai, that is one right next to each other. So often when this is translated in the English, they're combining those, not putting them right next to each other, because I think they're talking about the same things. Although there are some that will include include that. So, for example, like if you're reading from the ESV, that will go nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality. If you read it from like the King James Version, that says nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind. So some people are combining those in modern translations. And so I think Hodey's point here is like, oh, well, this just means effeminate. So this is talking about being soft, and you can see where he tries to get his argumentation in. But I would say that Malachi is being used in the context of things that are listed as like, clear sins and being used right in conjunction with arsena kotei. And so, for one, we would have to say that this not only does this grouping imply that malakos is some kind of sin, not just like a weakness in character or a lack of discipline, although it could just be that you're unrestrained, right? So if you're going to read it that way, that malakos means that like you're unrestrained in your passions. Okay, like that would still work. And so Hody could, like, there's two ways you could go with this. I could kind of agree with Hody on the term malakos or malachi, and that it's talking about being undisciplined, but that wouldn't take away from the greater point here. And one could also argue that it refers to something more grave than that when you're grouping it in that list and also grouping it with arsena kotei. Now, we should talk about what arsena kotei means, because Hody makes an argument that arsena kotei does not mean what I think it clearly means, but to just read what he said again. Arsena kotei is a word he said that Paul invented, and that it means a combination of two words, male, and the other one meaning bed, and it would appear to condemn men that bed other men, but that's not how the audience would have took it. It's a figurative meaning that identifies the exploitation of someone's body for personal gain, and that the crass sexuality is intended to be a symbol of taking advantage of someone, and he compares it to like white collar crime, and to not be an arsena kotei, to not be, and he talks about how other people have used it in this way. He says how the Sibylline oracle who commanded, "Do not steal seeds, do not arsena kotei, do not betray information, give to one who has labored his wage, do not oppress a poor man." And so that's his argument there. It's used to mean white collar thievery. He gives a couple. He says Theophilus, Bard Sains, and Epilites. Could be getting these pronunciations wrong. I'm not always the best with the ancient name pronunciation. So let me get back to I'm jumping around here with my notes. Let's look at what arsena kotei means. Arsena kotei combines the words male and bed, and it's referring to some of the sexual acts within the context of listing different sexual immorality, because it talked about sex. So, like, go back to the text here. Even let's go with the King James here, because it includes that word effeminate. I'm not usually a big King James guy, but he says, neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, the effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind. Notice he says abuser. King James goes abusers of themselves, meaning it's not abusing someone else. That, like, you're sitting against your body with someone else. And so this is being used in the context of adultery, of fornication. So he's like describing different sexual immoralities. So it kind of seem to have a sexual connotation, I would argue, based on that. Yeah, arsena kotei refers explicitly to men engaging in sexual acts with other men, further underscoring that the term then malakos or malachi in the context is associated with early Christian behavior. Now, this could be an area where there's maybe, I'm trying to be generous here, there's probably some legitimate scholarly disagreement over the best way to interpret these passages. But then I would say that the way we would settle this dispute could be a couple ways. It could be looking at the quality of the scholarship, could we look at the motivations of the scholarship, could be looking at who's in the majority position. I would also say that from a Christian perspective, how the church has traditionally interpreted something should be significant, and that church fathers who were contemporary or mostly contemporary with Paul and who understood Greek, that we should look to them, as a way to not just provide scholarly support, but also theological clarity. So I would say we look at early Christian writings, and they would reflect an understanding that the terms malakos and arsenokotai are associated with various forms of sexual immorality. Clement of Alexandria interpreted malakos as including both moral and sexual laxity, associating it with luxurious and indulgent lifestyles that lead to sexual immorality. John Chrysostom likewise associated malakos with effeminacy and moral weakness, condemning it in his homilies on sexual morality. Eusebius of Caesarea associated malakos with effeminacy and moral degradation, reflecting a broader cultural combination of behaviors deemed unnatural and morally lax. So I think, again, what's going on here is that words can have multiple meanings in multiple contexts, and that we can know the etymology of a word and then know how it develops. Actually, what's funny, the word gay is a perfect example of this, because the word gay did not always refer to homosexuality. It used to refer to different things, right? And now it has multiple meanings, even today. But if Paul invented this term, if it's rather new, it does combine arsen, male, with kotai, bed. And so that direct etymology is men who bed men, which is just quite clearly referring to homosexuality, which Paul's first use in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy both have that connotation of referring to sexual acts. We go to 1 Timothy here. Starting in verse 8, we know that the law is good. We must use it lawfully. Knowing this, the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for the sinners, for the unholy and profane, for the murderers and the murderers of fathers and the murderers of mothers and manslayers, for the whoremongers and for them who defile themselves with mankind, for the men stealers, for liars, for the perjured persons. So very, very, very similar there, similar usage. Again, I've cited John Chrysostom and Clement of Alexandria. They're both early Christian writers and theologians. They both understood Greek, and they interpreted these passages as condemning homosexual acts and labeling them as contrary to nature, and being within the broader discussion of sexual immorality. So when we look at the way the word is being used in the Bible, we look at the way the early church fathers who understood Greek and interpreted the use of those words, we come away with historical and textual evidence that the interpretation of arsenokotai and malakos there is the condemnation of all homosexual acts. Even early commentaries, such as those by the Latin Vulgate and church fathers, reinforce this understanding. Later, sort of like metaphorical uses of the term arsenokotai for broader immoral behaviors, such as exploitation, do not negate its original meaning. Words often develop secondary uses. Sometimes secondary usage becomes more popular than the original use. And that happens over time, but that doesn't mean that we then read that secondary use back into the original use. There's many words in the English language that have this usage. Like, think about the word web. Like the first time the word web is used, it's describing like what spiders make. It's describing a structure made by a spider. But now we use the word web and we're talking about the internet because it's like a web, right? But when you go back and read the book Charlotte's Web, you're not like, ooh, it's talking about Charlotte's internet, right? The word tablet, originally referred to a flat slab or surface for writing, and now it refers to portable computer devices. The word spam was originally a type of canned meat product that people had didn't like, it was undesirable. And now it refers to unsolicited and often irrelevant and inappropriate messages sent over the internet. We have the word mouse referring to a rodent. Now it refers to one of these, little computer mouse. Even again, like I said earlier, the word gay, think about like Christmas song, Don We Now Our Gay Apparel, so it's not talking about being homosexual there, but then it developed over time to be like, oh, he's gay, like he's attracted to men. But now there's a lot of people that go like, oh, like that's gay. And they just mean like that's dumb and it's a derogatory term. So it's funny that the word gay has evolved very similar to how arsenokotai has developed. But there was a point in time where arsenokotai was just referring to homosexuality. So like Hody has some points here, but he's overstating them. And then trying to read a development of a word over time and, how it's used colloquially and read it back into the original readings. But the term arsenokotai in Paul's epistles was clearly referring to homosexual acts, all of them, not just involuntary ones, based on the etymology, context, and enforced by the early interpretation of Christian writers who were very contemporary to the early church, who understood Greek. To read some quotes here, John Chrysostom on his homily on Romans, chapter 1, he says, all these affections then were vile, but chiefly the mad lust after males. For the soul is more the sufferer in sins, and more dishonored than the body in diseases. But if thou scoff at the hearing of hell and believest not that fire, remember Sodom. So Chrysostom's also saying that this was the sin of Sodom. Referring to it as a mad lust after males. Clement of Alexandria, in his book, the Pedagogus, book 3, chapter 3, it is not only the use of women that is called fornication, but also is the deviant practice of men with men or of women with women. For men of this type, despite possessing the form of men, yet at the same time lack a sense of shame. Such a person is therefore a kind of masculine woman. So Clement clearly identifying homosexual acts as a form of fornication and immoral behavior. There's writings from Tertullian on modesty. His writing in chapter 4 talks about frenzies of lust which exceed the laws of nature. So Tertullian also condemns it. Augustine condemns it. I already brought up Eusebius of Caesarea. There's just an overwhelming case here looking at the early church, and that's how they're interpreting those Greek terms in that way. They're all fairly contemporary to Paul. So, all right, well, this will be where we stop here. I think I've done a good job at arguing against Hody's points as of so far, but we're running short on time. It's already gone longer than I expected, and but I figured I had to do this in 2 parts. So we're going to handle the rest of Hody's arguments and kind of conclude the sort of topic I wanted to talk about here in next week's episode. So I don't like doing 2-parters all the time, but sometimes that's what's necessary to really dive deep into these passages and these theological arguments. So in conclusion so far, for what we've covered already, I think that we've clearly identified that the biblical model of marriage is monogamous, heterosexual, one male, one female, as that reflects Christ and his bride, the church. Jesus affirms this teaching, and that the arguments that side A makes so far, I think I've done a good job at explaining how these are kind of playing fast and loose by taking sort of modern concepts and reading them back into the writings that were made in antiquity and trying to perform, I think, what is clear eisegesis. We'll see then in next week's episode if I can continue in addressing the rest of Hody's arguments and the side A arguments, and then excuse me, I will then wrap everything up into a bow and explain my thoughts on how this pertains to libertarianism and Christianity. And I would say, just to give you a foreshadowing to that, it's important because we have to establish what is true whenever we're pursuing not only Christian norms, but also what is true in the realm of law. And there's a growing concern among many that, well, libertarianism necessarily promotes degeneracy and sexual hedonism. And I'm saying the case does not clearly have to be that. I want to defend first what the Christianity says, and then talk about how then we as Christian libertarians, once we know what the truth is regarding the topic, how we should respond to that. So next week's episode, we'll finish these arguments against side A and then draw those conclusions on how we then deal with this as libertarians together. So that's all I have for you guys for this week's episode. Again, I super appreciate you listening in. Make sure you like, subscribe, leave a review. All that helps us. Talk to you again next week. Until then, live at peace, live for Christ.
The Biblical Anarchy podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.